At about 11:30 in the morning on December 22, 1944, German soldiers walked toward the American lines surrounding Bastogne under white flags. 2 were officers and 2 were enlisted men. They carried an official written demand from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, the German commander responsible for the assault on the town. According to the message, the American force in Bastogne was in a hopeless situation. German troops had encircled the town, supply routes were cut, reinforcements seemed unlikely, and ammunition was running low. The Germans urged the Americans to surrender with honor before their artillery and armored units destroyed the entire position. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. He had been asleep when his staff entered his quarters and handed him the document. He read the formal demand, looked up with a mix of disbelief and irritation, and exclaimed a single word that instantly became legend: "Nuts!" His officers laughed, then hesitated. Could that really be the official reply to a formal surrender demand from a German general? McAuliffe insisted that it was the perfect answer. His operations officer, Colonel Harry Kinnard, agreed and had the message typed exactly as it had been spoken, including the spacing that emphasized the word. December 22, 1944. To the German commander, NUTS, the American commander. When the note was handed back to the German delegation, they were still wearing blindfolds. Confused, one of the German officers asked the Americans whether the reply was affirmative or negative. The interpreter answered firmly that it was entirely negative. Later, when they pressed again for clarification, he added a far less polite explanation in fluent German, telling them they could go to hell. The single word in McAuliffe's reply captured a fundamental difference in attitude between the American army and the military traditions of many other nations at the time. In most armies, a surrounded force typically entrenched itself, conserved ammunition, dug in, and simply waited for relief. The Americans at Bastogne intended to do far more than hold the perimeter. They prepared to fight with the intention of counterattacking when the opportunity arose. This mindset did not appear overnight. It was the product of years of deliberate reform. On September 1, 1939, the same day the German invasion of Poland ignited the Second World War in Europe, General George C. Marshall became Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He inherited a small, underfunded force of fewer than 200,000 soldiers scattered across 100 posts. Many units trained with outdated weapons left over from the First World War, and the daily routine resembled that of a peacetime constabulary rather than a force ready for modern mechanized war. Marshall understood from his own experience in France that future conflicts would require faster movement, quicker decision-making, and far more flexible leadership. From 1927 to 1932, during his time as assistant commandant of the infantry school at Fort Benning, Marshall had already begun transforming the way American officers were trained. Instead of relying on thick manuals and slow, predictable classroom exercises, he emphasized speed, initiative, and decisiveness. Young officers were confronted with sudden tactical problems during marches or field exercises and were expected to issue verbal orders within minutes. These drills rewarded imagination and aggression rather than caution. Officers who embraced this new style rose through the ranks. Those who clung to rigid routines or outdated ideas gradually faded from influential positions. By the late 1930s, the Army had begun to shift away from the mindset that had shaped it after World War I. When the United States entered the global conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Army had expanded to nearly 1 million personnel and operated on a doctrine that emphasized mobility, offensive action, and decentralized command. This meant that junior leaders were expected to make quick decisions, seize opportunities, and maintain momentum even without detailed instructions from above. The true test came in early 1943 during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. American forces, inexperienced and spread out, faced coordinated German and Italian units led by veteran commanders. The clash was brutal. The Americans were driven back up to 50 miles, losing tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, and many lives. For many soldiers, it was their first taste of modern mechanized warfare, and the shock was severe. However, despite the initial collapse, the line eventually stabilized. American and Allied units regrouped, planned a counterstrike, and within days regained much of the ground they had lost. The battle forced American leadership to confront the weaknesses in its command structure. Senior officers who failed to adapt were replaced by more aggressive commanders who embraced the principles of speed and flexible maneuver. This began a rapid refinement of American combined arms tactics. Infantry, armor, and artillery learned to coordinate closely and act with decisiveness and tempo. Through the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the army solidified its evolving doctrine. By the time American troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, they were no longer the inexperienced soldiers who had been pushed back at Kasserine. They were part of a modern, mobile war machine trained to push forward relentlessly, exploit openings, and act without waiting for perfect information. Even so, nothing from those earlier battles could fully prepare them for what awaited in the frozen Ardennes during the winter of 1944. The coming clash would become the largest battle fought by American forces in the Second World War. In the middle of that storm stood Bastogne, where a single defiant word had already signaled to the Germans that surrender was not an option. The siege of Bastogne tightened with every passing hour. Snow fell in thick, wind-driven sheets, covering the roads, the woods, the foxholes, even the bodies of men who had fallen the night before. The temperature dropped so low that rifles froze if they were not cleaned constantly. Vehicles stalled. Medics struggled to keep wounded soldiers alive because the cold alone could finish what shrapnel had begun. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, along with the tank destroyers, artillery, and support units trapped inside the perimeter, fought not only the German army but the winter itself. Food grew scarce. Some units survived on chocolate bars, hard biscuits, or whatever they could melt from frozen ration tins. Ammunition had to be rationed. Medical supplies were almost gone. Wounded men filled every cellar, barn, and makeshift aid station in town. Despite the suffering, morale stayed high. The men repeated McAuliffe's reply like a charm against despair. Whenever a shell crashed nearby or a patrol returned from a brutal fight in the woods, someone would mutter the word that had already become their emblem of defiance. The sound of it lifted spirits, strengthened resolve, and reminded every man that surrender was not even a distant possibility. The Germans did not remain idle. After receiving the curt rejection, General von Luttwitz ordered renewed pressure on every section of the American perimeter. Panzer forces pressed from the east. Infantry probed the southeastern approaches. Artillery began pounding the town with a new ferocity. At night, the sky flickered with the glow of burning farmhouses and shattered vehicles. The defenders were pushed to their limits, yet the line held firm. Small groups of paratroopers fought from tree lines and snowbanks, slicing into German advances with quick ambushes and then slipping back into the forest before larger forces could surround them. In the southern sector, a collection of engineers, tank destroyer crews, and paratroopers reinforced each other as German infantry attempted repeated breakthroughs. In the north, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment dug in among the pine trees. They repelled assault after assault, often fighting at ranges so close that grenades became more deadly than rifles. Trees shattered from artillery fire, sending splinters sharper than steel in every direction. The ground shook constantly from the impact of shells, yet the paratroopers refused to give up a single position without a fight. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe moved from command post to front line and back again, encouraging his men and staying in constant communication with regimental commanders. Officers studied hastily drawn maps by candlelight, tracing German movements by listening to reports of gunfire and the rumble of distant engines. Every unit understood that they were surrounded, but no one knew exactly how large the German force was. Messages trickled in from scattered patrols reporting enemy armor to the east, tanks near the west road, infantry massing in the south. Each report suggested that the noose around Bastogne was tightening. Despite the grim situation, the American lines did not collapse. The lessons forged in earlier campaigns became the backbone of their defense. Officers did not wait for orders from above. They moved squads and platoons where they were needed, launched small counterattacks to reclaim lost ground, and used speed and surprise to confuse the attackers. Even when ammunition was dangerously low, they conserved their remaining rounds for the exact moment when German troops entered the kill zone. Machine gun crews counted every belt of ammunition and fired in short, precise bursts. Mortar teams waited until the enemy had committed themselves before raining explosives into the packed formations. Christmas approached with the siege still tightening. Many soldiers celebrated only by sharing memories of home, whispered around camp stoves that barely produced enough heat to keep their fingers flexible. Chaplains moved among the units, offering prayers and comfort in between artillery barrages. In the center of town, the wounded huddled together beneath blankets as medics worked with whatever supplies they had left. Even in that harsh moment, many soldiers recalled years later that Christmas in Bastogne remained one of the most powerful memories of their lives. They were hungry, cold, exhausted, and nearly out of everything except courage. The Germans believed the Americans would break soon. They were wrong. The defenders continued to repulse attack after attack. German commanders became frustrated as their infantry units were cut down in the snow-covered woods or shredded by American artillery firing with uncanny accuracy. The American guns, though short on shells, were positioned skillfully. Forward observers climbed into church towers, barns, and treetops, directing fire on columns moving along narrow forest paths. Several German attempts to bring tanks close enough to crush the perimeter were halted by combined fire from tank destroyers and bazooka teams hidden in the ruins of small villages. The battle intensified on December 25th and December 26th. German armored formations tried to smash through the western and southern lines, hoping to seize the crossroads that made Bastogne so important. Tanks rumbled forward through the drifting snow, engines roaring in the cold air. American paratroopers waited behind hedgerows and in foxholes dug into frozen soil. As the lead tanks approached, bazooka teams crawled forward and fired at close range. Some rockets bounced off the thick frontal armor. Others hit the tracks or caught the engines on the sides, freezing the tanks in place. Infantry followed behind, firing rifles and submachine guns at the attackers, then disappearing again into the smoke and snow. Inside the command post, McAuliffe received a message that changed everything. The Third Army under General George Patton had broken through the German line to the south. Patton had pulled off one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war by turning his entire army 90 degrees in a matter of days, then driving it directly toward Bastogne through bitter cold and near impassable roads. American forces punched through German positions, clearing villages and pushing north with relentless speed. Every mile they advanced weakened the German grip on the surrounded town. On December 26th, tanks from the 4th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Bastogne. When the first tank rolled through the lines, the defenders erupted with cheers in spite of their exhaustion. Many were so weak from hunger and cold that they could barely stand, yet the sound of their relief carried through the snow-filled streets. Medics rushed to transfer wounded men to new evacuation points. Supply convoys crept into the town under constant artillery fire, bringing ammunition, food, blankets, and medical gear. For the first time in days, hot meals reached the front line. The siege was lifted, but the fighting in the region was far from over. The German counteroffensive continued to rage across the Ardennes. However, the failure to capture Bastogne had already crippled the momentum of the attack. The town was a critical hub of roads, and holding it prevented the Germans from linking their advancing spearheads. The defenders had denied the enemy the ability to redirect forces or move their supplies efficiently. That delay allowed Allied units to reorganize, bring up reinforcements, and prepare a counteroffensive that would eventually drive the Germans back toward their own border. Bastogne had not been a symbolic stand. It had been a strategic triumph born from grit, training, and leadership. The American soldiers who fought there had applied every lesson learned from earlier battles, including the painful memory of Kasserine. The aggressive doctrine Marshall had developed years earlier at Fort Benning had been tested fully in the snow and forests of Belgium. Soldiers acted without hesitation, seized initiative whenever they could, and believed entirely in their ability to overcome the odds. The simple word McAuliffe had spoken now echoed across the entire Western Front. It summed up not only the refusal to surrender but the spirit of an army that had been shaped deliberately for moments just like this. Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience, and the Battle of the Bulge marked the point where the German offensive finally began to unravel. The sudden calm that settled over the Ardennes the night after the breakout felt unnatural, as if the forest itself were bracing for what would come next. The roads behind the German spearheads were already choking with wrecked vehicles, abandoned supply trucks, and wandering groups of soldiers who no longer knew where their units had gone. Even senior commanders admitted privately that the offensive had outrun its own lifeline, but no one dared speak the words aloud in front of Hitler. On the American side, the situation was equally chaotic, though in a different way. Reinforcements were arriving faster than anyone expected. Fresh infantry divisions, armored groups, engineers, and artillery units poured into the region, often driving straight from training camps with little idea of what they were about to face. Yet their arrival shifted the balance. Command posts that had been barely hanging on now felt strength returning to their lines. Whole towns that had been written off as lost suddenly became fortified strongholds. The men in the 101st Airborne, who had been told they were surrounded at Bastogne, refused to let the negativity sink in. They had no winter gear, little food, and not nearly enough ammunition. Still, they held their positions with a level of determination that shocked the German units trying to push them aside. Every attempt to break through the perimeter was met with disciplined counterfire. And every time the Germans regrouped for another assault, the Americans repositioned, patched their lines, and braced themselves again. By December 23rd, the weather finally shifted. The thick blanket of clouds that had grounded Allied air power since the beginning of the German attack began to break apart. Slivers of blue sky appeared first, then full clearings that revealed the snow-covered ground below. For the soldiers huddled in foxholes, the moment sunlight touched the forest felt like an omen. Minutes later, they heard the deep rumble of engines above them. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft swept across the Ardennes, attacking columns that had been hidden for days. The effect was immediate and devastating. German tanks tried desperately to hide in tree lines or under camouflage nets that had worked during the blizzard. Now they stood out clearly against the snow. Convoys stretched along the roads became perfect targets. Fuel dump explosions lit the horizon like burning beacons. Even the most determined German commanders realized the advantage had flipped for good. Inside the Führer's headquarters, reports poured in one after another, each worse than the last. Hitler grew increasingly agitated, insisting the offensive could still achieve its goals if only the commanders showed more resolve. Rundstedt, Model, and other high-ranking officers exchanged glances but held their silence. They already understood what Hitler refused to admit. The window for success had closed. The momentum was gone, the reserves were depleted, and the Allies now controlled the skies. On Christmas Day, the decisive blow fell. Elements of General Patton's Third Army smashed into the southern edge of the German perimeter around Bastogne. The breakthrough was sudden and forceful, catching German units off guard. American tanks rolled through the snow-covered fields toward the town while artillery thundered behind them. The defenders of Bastogne, exhausted but unbroken, could hear the thunder of engines approaching and knew help was coming. The link-up with Patton's forces transformed the battle. Bastogne, once considered lost, became the staging point for a renewed American counteroffensive. German divisions that had expected to push west now found themselves fighting to escape encirclement. Their fuel was running dangerously low. Some tank crews resorted to siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles or even civilian sources. Others simply walked away from machines that could no longer move. Up north, Montgomery coordinated the tightening of Allied lines, focusing on containing any possible German breakout attempts. His method was deliberate, methodical, and cautious, but it achieved one key objective. There would be no renewed German surge. Every move the Germans attempted was blocked before it could gain momentum. American commanders further south, with their more aggressive style, began slicing into German flanks. The enemy, which only days earlier had seemed unstoppable, now looked fractured and uncertain. The turning point became undeniable when American forces retook the town of St. Vith. Its capture reopened critical supply routes and eliminated one of the last German strongpoints capable of delaying the Allied advance. Once St. Vith fell, the entire German operation began unraveling. Units that had fought bravely for days were now facing encirclement or total collapse. Officers struggled to maintain order as fatigue, Lack of supplies and constant air attacks tore apart their formations. By early January, the remaining German troops were retreating toward their original lines, fighting rearguard actions to protect what remained of their armored divisions. The forest that had offered them concealment at the start of the offensive now became a death trap. American patrols hunted through the trees, clearing out pockets of resistance. Artillery strikes followed any signs of movement, and the skies remained filled with Allied aircraft. The German High Command finally ordered a full withdrawal, though Hitler insisted on calling it a planned regrouping. No one believed that what had begun as a daring attempt to split the Allied armies and negotiate from a position of strength had ended in exhaustion, loss, and the irreversible weakening of Germany's last major reserves. The first weeks of January brought a grim clarity to the German commanders still clinging to their positions in the Ardennes. What had begun as a bold gamble had turned into a desperate effort to escape annihilation. Snow continued to fall across the forest, covering the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that would never move again. The once quiet roads now formed a map of destruction, marked by burned-out vehicles and frozen bodies. For many German soldiers, the retreat felt less like a movement toward safety and more like a slow collapse into inevitability. American forces pushed forward relentlessly. Fresh divisions arrived every day, their supply lines flowing smoothly from the west. They advanced with a confidence that had been absent in the early days of the battle. Artillery barrages softened enemy positions before infantry swept through. Engineers cleared roads under fire, allowing tanks to move without delay. Air support hovered above every major push, striking targets that tried to slip away through the trees. The Germans, once the hunters in the opening days of the offensive, now found themselves trapped like prey. For the first time, captured German soldiers began openly admitting their doubts. Many said they had never believed in the offensive from the start, that the plan had seemed too ambitious, too dependent on perfect timing and impossible luck. Others confessed that fuel shortages had haunted them long before they reached Belgian soil. Tank commanders spoke of driving forward with barely enough fuel for another day's advance, praying each seized Allied depot would give them enough to continue. When those depots failed to appear, the truth became impossible to ignore. In cities and villages across the region, civilians who had endured the German advance now witnessed the reversal of fortune in real time. In some towns, German troops trudged through the streets in disorder, leaving behind equipment they no longer had the strength or fuel to haul away. In others, they attempted to fortify positions that once seemed temporary but now felt like final refuges. Meanwhile, American units moved through the same roads with discipline and purpose, restoring order where they passed. The Allied High Command recognized the opportunity. With Germany's armored forces trapped in a narrowing pocket, they saw the possibility of destroying the last significant reserves the enemy possessed. Plans were drafted to encircle the retreating Germans entirely, cutting off their escape routes and ending the campaign with a decisive blow. Patton pressed for a rapid advance, urging his commanders to exploit every German weakness. Montgomery argued for a more controlled approach, ensuring no gaps would allow German forces to slip away. Though their styles differed, the result was the same. The Allied front tightened around the shrinking German line. German generals pleaded for reinforcements that did not exist. The promised reserves were already exhausted or too far away to matter. Units that once boasted hundreds of tanks now had only a handful operable machines left. Fuel trucks were empty. Ammunition had to be rationed, sometimes down to the last shells. Communications faltered as radios froze or were destroyed. In the forest, the once feared armored divisions of the Reich were reduced to scattered groups of weary men trying to survive long enough to retreat. By mid-January, the Americans launched a coordinated counteroffensive aimed at collapsing what remained of the German Bulge. The push met pockets of fierce resistance, especially from seasoned German troops who refused to yield easily. But each stand ended the same way, overwhelmed by firepower, air attacks, and numbers they could not match. The German defense grew more frantic as the days passed, their lines bending and breaking under pressure. Every kilometer lost further eroded any hope of salvaging the operation. The most dramatic clashes occurred near Huffeleis, where two major American forces advanced from opposite directions with the goal of linking up and sealing the pocket. German units, sensing the trap closing around them, fought with desperation, launching counterattacks designed to buy just enough time for their comrades to slip away. But the Americans were determined. Through relentless artillery fire and coordinated armored charges, they tightened the noose. Soldiers later recalled seeing German troops abandon heavy equipment in the fields, choosing speed over firepower in their scramble for survival. The forests thundered with explosions as Allied aircraft pounded the remaining escape routes. Roads once used for the German advance were now littered with twisted steel and frozen bodies. Columns attempting to withdraw under cover of darkness found themselves illuminated by flares that turned night into day. The air was filled with the whine of engines, the roar of bombs, and the screams of wounded men. Many German commanders realized that their once formidable divisions were dissolving around them. On January 16th, the link-up at Houffalize was complete. The Northern and Southern American forces joined hands, cutting the German Bulge in half and sealing the fate of any units still caught inside. The remaining German troops fought to break free, but their efforts were fragmented and poorly supplied. Some managed to escape through narrow forest trails, abandoning everything but their weapons. Others were captured after running out of ammunition. Entire battalions surrendered, exhausted and frostbitten, unable to continue. The battle was not yet over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans had lost the initiative, their last reserves, and any real hope of regaining control of the Western Front. The offensive that had begun with such confidence now lay in ruins. Snow-covered fields that once echoed with the sound of advancing panzers were now silent except for the distant rumble of Allied guns steadily pushing eastward. The final days of the Ardennes campaign unfolded under a sky that had turned clear and painfully cold, as if the winter itself wanted to preserve every ruined tank and shattered tree in perfect stillness. The Germans who survived the retreat moved like shadows across the snow, gaunt and exhausted, their uniforms torn and stiff with ice. Only a few weeks earlier, they had surged forward with confidence, believing they might split the Allied armies and tilt the war back in their favor. Now they were simply trying to reach the safety of their old defensive lines before the Americans closed in completely. American forces pressed forward without pause. Their commanders understood that the enemy was broken and that each hour mattered. Artillery units rolled into position on freshly cleared roads. Sherman tanks pushed across open fields that had been death traps only days before. Infantry advanced cautiously but steadily, sweeping the forests and villages for any pockets of resistance. Each captured hill or crossroads revealed more evidence of the German retreat. Abandoned gun positions, burned-out vehicles, frozen soldiers left where they fell. Even so, the Germans were not finished fighting. Several disciplined units formed rearguard lines to delay the American advance. These troops dug into the woods, set up machine gun nests, and used the terrain to inflict as much damage as possible before pulling back again. Their sacrifice allowed thousands of their comrades to escape encirclement, but it also underscored how desperate the situation had become. The once proud armored divisions of the Reich were now forced into defensive scrambles just to survive. Inside the German command structure, frustration boiled over. Arguments erupted between senior officers over who was responsible for the catastrophe. Some blamed the lack of fuel. Others blamed the Allied air superiority. A few admitted quietly that the entire plan had been doomed from the start, too ambitious for a nation already stretched past its limits. The most outspoken generals argued that the offensive should have been halted days earlier, before so many formations were lost. But no amount of anger could undo the damage. The truth was undeniable. The final strategic hope of Nazi Germany had disappeared in the snows of the Ardennes. American civilians back home soon heard about the victory, though few initially understood how close the Allies had come to disaster in the first days of the battle. The newspapers printed dramatic headlines celebrating the resilience of the defenders at Bastogne and the speed of Patton's advance. Photographs of soldiers in white camouflaged capes trudging through forests captured the harsh reality of the fighting. Stories of defiance, such as the now famous refusal to surrender Bastogne, became symbols of Allied determination. Yet the victory had come at a terrible cost. Thousands of Americans had been killed, wounded or captured. Entire towns had been reduced to rubble. Families across the United States soon opened telegrams bearing news they had dreaded. By late January, the last German troops pulled back across their original lines. Their offensive had not only failed but had crippled their ability to defend against the Allied push that would soon follow. The armored divisions that Hitler had counted on to repel the invasion were badly mauled. Many would never fully recover. Factories in Germany were already struggling under relentless bombing. Fuel shortages worsened. The young recruits sent to fill the gaps lacked training and experience. The army that once dominated Europe was now fighting with its back against its borders. For the Allies, the end of the Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point. With the German threat in the west neutralized, they prepared for the final push into the heart of the Reich. Plans were drawn for crossing the Rhine. Supply lines were reorganized. Fresh reinforcements moved to the front. The soldiers who had survived the Ardennes knew that the hardest battles were still ahead, but they also understood that Germany had played its last major card. The enemy could still fight fiercely, but it would never again mount an attack of such scale. The Ardennes forest gradually fell silent again as the armies moved east. The destroyed villages, the frozen bodies, and the twisted metal ruins remained behind as grim reminders of the ferocious struggle that had taken place. Months later, when spring arrived and the snow melted, locals would discover the full extent of the devastation. They would find helmets half buried in the soil, rifles leaning against collapsed walls, and tank tracks imprinted deep into the earth. The land itself seemed to hold the memory of the battle. Historians would later call it the last great gamble of Hitler's war, a desperate attempt to change the outcome of a conflict already slipping out of Germany's grasp. The Allies viewed it as a hard-fought victory that proved their resilience and coordination even under the most dangerous circumstances. For the soldiers who lived through it, however, the Battle of the Bulge was something far more personal. It was a test of endurance in the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades, a struggle of exhaustion and courage, and a confrontation with an enemy that refused to collapse until it was too late. By the time the final shots faded across the Ardennes, the shape of the war had changed forever. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The road to the Rhine lay open, and beyond it, the heartland of the Third Reich. The men who marched eastward carried with them the scars of the winter battle, but also the certainty that they were witnessing the beginning of the end. The Bulge had been broken, and with it, the last hope of Nazi Germany. If this story resonated with you, consider giving the video a like. Your support helps us continue bringing important chapters of World War II to light. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next historical journey. Every story we share carries lessons that remain meaningful even today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans countries and generations, connected by a shared desire to understand how history continues to shape our world.